The air in the Oval Office, usually a carefully controlled 72 degrees, felt thick, heavy with the ghosts of decisions past and the oppressive weight of the one looming. It was an atmosphere the president had grown accustomed to, the psychic residue of a century of crises managed and averted within these curved walls. Yet, tonight it felt different, sharper. The silence between the ticks of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to stretch, each second a small, taut measure of the hours remaining. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the 46th President of the United States, sat not behind the resolute desk, but in one of the striped armchairs near the fireplace, a worn, leather-bound briefing book open but unread on his lap. Its pages, filled with charts, polling data, and prepared rejoinders, were a testament to the meticulous work of his staff, an army of the nation's brightest minds. They had war-gamed every scenario, anticipated every attack, crafted every pivot, but the book could not account for the weariness that settled deep in his bones, a fatigue that was more than just the late hour or the lingering effects of a common cold that had roughened his voice to a persistent rasp. It was the existential exhaustion of a man who had spent a lifetime in the arena, now facing what felt like the final, his most consequential contest. He ran a hand over his face, the skin thin and dry. His gaze drifted to the portrait of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the patrician face calm, resolute, a man who had stared down economic collapse and global war. Roosevelt had projected an aura of effortless command, even from his wheelchair. The lesson was clear. Strength was not the absence of infirmity, but the projection of unwavering will in spite of it. The president's team had reminded him of this again and again. Project Strength. Be the steady hand. Remind them who you are, what you've done. He had nodded, absorbing their earnest, anxious advice. He knew the stakes. The entire Western alliance, the fragile post-war order, the very concept of American democracy, felt as if it were balanced on the precipice of this one night. This 190-minute performance under the Klieg lights in Atlanta, his opponent, he knew, was feeling none of this weight. Or if he was, he metabolized it differently, turning pressure into pure, unadulterated energy. Miles away, in the gilded confines of his New Jersey golf club, Donald John Trump was not studying a briefing book. He was consuming the political landscape, absorbing the energy of his own myth. He stood before a phalanx of television screens in a private lounge, each tuned to a different news network. The sound was muted, but the images spoke a language he understood better than anyone, the language of spectacle. He saw his own face, confident, defiant, often looking strained, aged by the relentless C-SPAN camera. He didn't need binders of data on the southern border. He had the images seared into his mind, and more importantly, into the minds of his followers. He had the sound bites, the slogans, the visceral, gut-level arguments that bypassed the cerebral cortex and went straight for the amygdala. His preparation was not a process of academic study, but of theatrical rehearsal. He paced the plush carpet, a predator limbering up before a hunt. He workshopped lines with a small, sycophantic circle of aides, testing their cadence, their punch. He wasn't memorizing facts. He was honing insults. He was sharpening the shiv. His strategy was brutally simple. A battering ram aimed at the two perceived pillars of his opponent's weakness, his age and his handling of the border. He would conflate the two, weaving a narrative of a nation whose frontiers were as porous and undefended as the mind of its commander-in-chief. It was cruel, it was personal, and he believed with every fiber of his being that it would be devastatingly effective. He felt the familiar thrum of anticipation, the addictive cocktail of adrenaline and self-regard that came before a big show. He was not a politician preparing for a debate. He was a heavyweight champion ready for the ring, envisioning the knockout blow. The journey to Atlanta was a study in contrasts. Air Force One, a flying symbol of American power and statecraft, was a vessel of quiet, focused tension. The president spent the flight in his private cabin, trying to rest his voice, sipping warm tea with honey and lemon. His wife Jill sat with him, her presence a silent, steadying force. She smoothed his tie, her fingers lingering for a moment. On his shoulder, a small gesture of transference, trying to impart some of her own strength. His aides moved with hushed efficiency, their faces etched with a professional gravity that barely masked a gnawing anxiety. Every cough from the president's cabin sent a ripple of concern through the staff section. They were flying into a storm, and their pilot felt unwell. The Challenger's plane, Private 757 emblazoned with his name, was a different world. The mood was boisterous, confident. The cabin was a flying war room, buzzing with the energy of an impending victory. The former president held court, regaling his entourage with tales of past triumphs, his voice booming, full of vigor. He was feeding on their adulation, drawing strength from their belief in his invincibility. He looked out the window at the clouds below, seeing not a country to govern, but a kingdom to reclaim. He was not flying to a debate. He was descending from on high to pass judgment. The CNN studio in Atlanta was a sterile, cold cathedral of modern media. The set was minimalist. 2 lecterns standing like monoliths on a stark blue stage, bathed in a light so bright and clinical it seemed to strip away all artifice. The silence of the empty studio was profound, a vacuum waiting to be filled with conflict. There would be no live audience, a condition the Biden campaign had insisted on. Hoping to deny their opponent the energy he drew from a crowd, it was a strategic choice that would, in the devastating calculus of hindsight, backfire spectacularly. In the vacuum, every stumble, every pause, every rasp of a voice would be magnified, echoing in millions of living rooms across a deeply divided nation. In the final moments before they took the stage, the 2 men were in their separate holding rooms, mirror images of preparation. The president stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie, his reflection looking back at him. Stranger he was still trying to fully inhabit. He cleared his throat, the sound a rough, gravelly scrape. He recited a line from his opening statement, the words feeling foreign, rehearsed. He was trying to summon the man he was, the man he needed to be, felt the immense, crushing pressure to be perfect, to be the wise elder statesman, the steady hand on the tiller, the former president. In his room was also looking in a mirror. But he saw not a stranger, but an icon of his own making. He saw the face that had launched 1,000 rallies, the brand that had redefined American politics. He practiced a smirk, a look of pity and condescension. It was not summoning a persona. He was reveling in it. He felt the familiar surge, the certainty that he controlled the narrative, that he was the sun around which the entire political solar system revolved. He was ready. The walk to the stage was a short eternity. The 2 men emerged from opposite, wings converging at the center. There was no handshake, another pre-negotiated term. They stood at their lecterns, separated by 10 feet of politically charged space. The moderators, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash, offered brief, professional greetings. The lights intensified. The camera's silent, unblinking red eyes came to life. The world was watching. The opening minutes were a flurry of rehearsed blows and parries on the economy. The president, his voice noticeably hoarse, detailed his administration's accomplishments, ticking off legislative victories and economic statistics. He leaned on the familiar architecture of his stump speech, the words a shield against the man standing beside him. The former president listened with a look of theatrical disbelief, a slight shake of the head, a smirk playing on his lips. He was letting his opponent speak, letting him expend energy, letting that rough voice grate on the ears of the electorate. When his turn came, he did not engage on the substance of economic policy. He pivoted instantly with a predator's instinct. For the weak point, he turned to the border. His voice, in contrast to the president's, was strong, confident, a torrent of accusations. He painted a lurid, apocalyptic picture of the southern frontier. He spoke of an invasion, of crime, of chaos. He used numbers like weapons, rapid-fire statistics on migrant encounters, on fentanyl seizures, on the cost to taxpayers. The veracity of the figures was secondary to their velocity. It's an overwhelming barrage designed to stun, to disorient. The president listened, his expression hardening. He had been prepped for this. This was Trump's signature issue, the bedrock of his political identity. The briefing book had a whole section on it, complete with counterpoints, context, and a defense of his own administration's complex, multi-pronged approach. He knew what he was supposed to say. He was supposed to reframe the issue to speak of compassion and order, to talk about the root causes of migration, to highlight the bipartisan border security bill that his opponent's allies had scuttled. The moderators turned to him. The camera zoomed in, framing his face in tight close-up. The nation leaned in. This was the moment. The attack had been made. The response was due, and then nothing. A cavernous silence opened up. The president opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He paused, his eyes darting slightly to the side, searching for the thought, the phrase, the first word of the carefully constructed rebuttal that now lay buried, inaccessible, under a sudden avalanche of cognitive fog. In that split second, the vast machinery of his mind, the decades of experience, the hours of preparation, sputtered and seized. The briefing book in his head had slammed shut. He saw the teleprompter in his mind's eye, but the words were a blurry, unintelligible jumble. He felt the rasp in his throat, a physical manifestation of the sudden, catastrophic failure of his rhetorical faculties. The heat of the lights felt immense, suffocating. The unblinking red eye of the camera felt like a laser boring into him, exposing him. He was aware, in a horrifyingly lucid way, of the millions watching, of the seconds ticking by. Each one, a hammer blow against the fragile facade of his authority. He could feel the narrative shifting, the ground giving way beneath him. His opponent did the one thing that was more devastating than interrupting. He stood perfectly still. He did not speak. He simply watched, a small, knowing smile on his face. He let the silence do the work. He let the president's struggle unfold, raw and excruciating, for the entire world to see. It was a moment of supreme political cruelty, a masterclass in nonverbal communication. His stillness was an accusation. His silence was a verdict. Finally, after an eternity that lasted perhaps 7 or 8 seconds, the president found a fragment of a thought. He began to speak, but the words were halting, disjointed. He mentioned a statistic, but it came out garbled. He tried to pivot to the bipartisan bill, but he lost the thread of the sentence halfway through. He used the phrase, the billion, the $1 trillion, a verbal stumble that made no sense. Stray fragment from a different half-remembered talking point. His voice was weak, a pale shadow of the command it was supposed to project. He looked down at his lectern, as if the answer might be inscribed on its surface. He looked lost. It was over. In that single, drawn-out moment of hesitation and confusion, the debate was lost. The election, some would later say, was lost. Everything that followed was merely an epilogue to that one brutal scene. The former president saw it. A flicker of undisguised triumph flashed in his eyes. He had landed the knockout blow without throwing a punch. He had simply created the opening, and his opponent had stumbled into it. From that point on, he was in total command. He grew more expansive, more confident. He repeated his claims, now imbued with the unassailable authority of a man who had just watched his rival publicly crumble. The president, for his part, tried to recover, soldiered on through the remaining 80 minutes. There were moments when he seemed to find his footing, when he delivered a cogent point on foreign policy or a sharp critique of his opponent's record, but the damage was done. The image was seared into the national consciousness. He was a fighter who had been knocked down in the first round and was now staggering, trying to stay on his feet until the final bell. His physical demeanor had changed. His shoulders seemed to slump slightly. The effort to project strength was now visible, strain that only served to highlight the weakness it was meant to conceal. Inside the CNN control room, a funereal quiet had descended. The producers and directors watched the monitors, their faces grim. They knew they were witnessing a moment of historic political consequence. On one side of the split screen, a preening, dominant victor. On the other, a diminished, struggling incumbent. It was a visual that needed no commentary. In the Biden campaign's designated viewing room, the mood was one of escalating panic. Aides stared at the screen in disbelief, their hands covering their mouths. The frantic typing on laptops had ceased. The confident chatter of the pre-debate hour was replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. They were watching their candidate, their leader, the President of the United States, being systematically dismantled on live television. The carefully crafted strategy, the binders of research, all of it had evaporated under the heat of the lights. They were witnessing a political car crash in slow motion. In the Trump campaign's room, the atmosphere was electric. There were muted cheers, backslaps, and wide, incredulous grins. They had hoped for a good night, a solid performance. They had not dared to dream of a rout this total, this definitive. Their candidate was not just winning, he was annihilating. The silence from Biden was the sound of their victory, a sound more satisfying than the loudest applause. The rest of the debate unfolded as a grim formality. The moderators, sensing the sea change, tried to maintain a semblance of order, but the dynamic was irrevocably set. The former president treated their questions as mere suggestions, launching into his favored talking points, circling back again and again to the border, to his opponent's frailty. He was no longer debating, he was delivering a victory speech. The president, meanwhile, was fighting a battle on two fronts, one against his opponent on the stage, and a more desperate internal one against his own voice. His own fatigue, his own faltering memory. Each sentence was an effort. He took sips of water, the gesture a small, desperate attempt to reclaim a moment of composure, to soothe the raw fire in his throat. But the rasp remained, a constant, audible reminder of his infirmity. When the 90 minutes were finally, mercifully over, the two men walked away from their lecterns. The former president strode off the stage with a conqueror's gait, his hand raised in a triumphant wave to the empty studio, playing to the real audience, the millions watching at home. He was met by his wife, Melania, her smile a rare public acknowledgement of his success. His entourage swarmed him, their faces alight with jubilation. The president's exit was a slower, more somber affair. He walked stiffly, his face a mask of exhaustion and disappointment. Jill met him, her expression a careful mixture of support and concern. She took his arm, her grip firm, as if to hold him up. His aides formed a protective circle around him, their faces grim, shielding him from the cameras as they guided him backstage. The air around them was thick with the unspoken recognition of a disaster. The immediate aftermath was a digital tsunami. Before the post-debate analysis shows had even begun, the clips were already viral. The moment of silence, the halting, confused response. The garbled phrase about $1 billion, $1 trillion. It was sliced, diced, and disseminated across every platform imaginable. It played on an endless loop on cable news, on Twitter, on TikTok, on Facebook. It became a meme, a GIF, a symbol. The narrative was set, hardened into digital concrete within minutes. The president was not up to the job. News channels, from the openly hostile to the professionally sympathetic, were brutal. Split screens showed a vibrant, dominant Trump next to a pale, faltering Biden. Headlines crafted for maximum impact, blared from websites and news tickers. Biden stumbles. A disastrous night, fears realized. The analysis from pundits, even those on the left, was devastating. Words like panic, catastrophe, and calamity filled the airwaves. The conversation was no longer about policy or the future of the country. It was about a single, stark question: could Joe Biden continue? In the days that followed, the political world convulsed. The president's supporters were thrown into a state of shock and despair. The confident talking points of the morning of the debate now sounded like hollow delusions. Anxious phone calls and text messages flew between donors, strategists, and elected officials. Quiet conversations in the halls of Congress turned into urgent, hushed discussions about what, if anything, could be done. The foundation of his campaign. The idea of him as the only one who could beat his predecessor. It's correct. Conversely, the challenger's camp was supercharged. His rallies, already large and fervent, swelled in size and intensity. The crowds were ecstatic, electrified by the perceived victory. They saw in their leader's debate performance a confirmation of everything they believed: that he was strong, that he was a fighter, that he had been right all along. They chanted his name with renewed vigor, their voices a rising chorus of vindication. The clips of Biden's faltering were played on the large screens at these rallies. A ritualistic humiliation of the vanquished foe met with roars of approval and derision. The hardline approach on the border, once a controversial policy, was now framed as the common-sense solution of a strong leader, validated by the apparent weakness of his opponent. The president retreated from public view for a day, sequestered with his closest advisors at Camp David. The idyllic mountain retreat, usually a place of respite, became a crisis command center. The conversations were raw, anguished. The polling data, which showed a catastrophic drop, they debated strategy, the options ranging from a defiant counterattack to a humble admission of a bad night. But they all knew that no strategy could erase the image that was now burned into the nation's retina. The president himself was forced to confront the abyss that had opened up on that stage. He had to watch the clips, a clinical, brutal exercise. In self-assessment, he saw what the world saw, a man who looked old, who sounded weak, who had failed at the most critical moment. The private reality of his age. The occasional stumbles and memory lapses that his staff had carefully managed and concealed had been laid bare for all to see. The protective bubble had burst. He sat alone in Aspen Lodge, a fire crackling in the hearth, the warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within him. He thought of his long career, the Senate victories, the vice presidency, the hard-won battle for the soul of the nation that had brought him to the White House. He thought of his son, Beau, whose memory he had invoked so many times as the source of his strength and purpose. He felt as if he had failed him, failed them all. The weight of the office, which he had carried with a sense of solemn duty, now felt like an impossible burden. It was not the attacks of his opponent that wounded him most deeply. It was the betrayal of his own body, his own mind, on that brightly lit stage. The final image was not of the victor, gloating in his gaudy palace, nor of the panicked strategist staring at plummeting poll numbers. It was of the president late on a Friday night, having returned to the White House. He stood alone in the center of the Oval Office. The room dark, save for the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the bulletproof windows. The grandfather clock ticked on, its rhythm indifferent, marking the passage of time. The inexorable march toward a future that was now terrifyingly uncertain. He looked at the resolute desk, that symbol of power and authority, and it seemed impossibly distant. An artifact from a different man's life. He raised a hand to his throat, the memory of the rasp, the sensation of the words failing to form, still viscerally present. It was the silence that haunted him. Not the roar of the crowd or the clamor of his opponent, but the silent, empty space where his own strength was supposed to be. It was the silence of a fall from grace, a fall that had happened in an instant, but whose echoes would now define the twilight of his life and perhaps the fate of the nation he had sworn to lead.